A peaceful man's home is violently attacked by fake HOA guards who destroy everything he worked for without warning. These impostors think they can intimidate him with no consequences, but they have no idea who they're messing with. When James Harrison, a former Delta Force commander, decides it's time to reclaim control, the tables turn in the most unexpected way. But just wait until you see how the story ends and why justice was finally served. James Harrison had always prided himself on leading a quiet, unassuming life. His home stood on the outskirts of town, nestled away from the frantic pulse of city life. It was a place he had carefully built, a sanctuary he could call his own. The tall iron gates that guarded his property were more than just a boundary. They were a symbol of his hard work, his determination, and his peaceful solitude. He could spend hours maintaining them, polishing the metal, making sure every inch was flawless. It was a reflection of who he was, meticulous, thoughtful, and deeply protective of what he had. But that calm, ordered life came to an abrupt halt one evening, shattering the peace he had worked so hard to preserve. James had just returned home after a long day. He was looking forward to a quiet evening, a book, maybe a warm meal, and a chance to unwind. But as he turned the corner toward his property, his heart sank. There, standing in front of his gates, was a group of people dressed in uniform, all wearing the unmistakable insignia of the HOA, or at least something that looked like it. Their badges were hastily stamped, the lettering too clean and too new, clearly a low-effort reproduction. And then, without any warning, they started. One of them raised a crowbar high, and with a loud metallic screech, slammed it against the iron gates. Another followed suit, hammering the gates with reckless abandon. The sound of metal being bent and torn filled the air, drowning out everything else. "This is a violation!" one of the intruders shouted, his voice filled with authority. "We have the right to inspect all property boundaries and structures. This gate is in violation of HOA guidelines." James was frozen for a moment, a mix of confusion and disbelief flooding over him. His first instinct was to think it was a misunderstanding, perhaps a mistake, a simple error. But the longer he stood there, the clearer it became that this wasn't a mistake. This was something deliberate, something personal. His mind raced as he approached them, his heart pounding in his chest. "Stop!" he shouted, his voice firm. "What are you doing? These gates were installed with full approval, according to every rule and regulation." But the more he spoke, the more the intruders ignored him. They didn't even glance his way as they continued to smash the gates with their tools, as if they had the right to do whatever they pleased. Each strike seemed to hit harder, each blow more destructive, until the gates began to buckle and groan under the force. James stepped forward, his voice tightening with frustration. "You can't just do this. You don't have the authority to destroy my property." But the words barely registered. One of the men looked at him briefly, offering nothing more than a dismissive sneer. They weren't there to listen. They weren't there to resolve anything. They were there to tear his life apart, piece by piece. James's hands clenched into fists, his anger rising with each passing second. He could feel the heat of the injustice burning through him. His mind screamed that this was wrong, that this shouldn't be happening, but all he could do was watch as these fake, Officials continued their destruction. They were testing him, pushing him to his limits, and in that moment, James realized something. This wasn't just about the gates. This was about respect. This was about control. And they had just crossed a line. His pulse quickened. He could feel his body respond, a surge of adrenaline pushing through his veins. He had been calm, quiet, patient for years, but something in him had snapped. This was no longer a simple violation. This was an attack. He stood there for a moment longer, fighting the rising urge to lash out. These men had no idea who they were dealing with. They thought they could walk onto his property, break his things, and walk away unscathed. But James Harrison wasn't just a homeowner. He was a man who had learned to defend everything he valued, and now they were about to learn that lesson the hard way. James stood motionless in front of the wreckage of his gates, the smell of metal and dust hanging in the air like a bitter reminder of the invasion. His heart was a storm of emotions, disbelief, rage, and the creeping realization that he had been left with no options. No apologies were coming, no explanations, and certainly no remorse from the group that had trespassed onto his property. The voices of the fake guards faded into the distance as they walked away, leaving only the aftermath of their destruction. He stared at the twisted iron, his mind working faster than ever. He could hear the faint echoes of the shouts and the ringing sound of metal on metal. He had tried reasoning with them, tried to assert his rights, but it was clear now that diplomacy was useless. They didn't care. They were nothing more than opportunistic criminals wearing the guise of authority. And that's when the anger inside him crystallized into something far more dangerous. James wasn't just some ordinary man. He wasn't the meek, mild homeowner these intruders assumed he was. He had been trained to fight, to protect, and to command. Once, he had been a leader of an elite unit, a Delta Force commander with years of experience in operations that demanded precision, strategy, and above all, results. These fake guards might have seen him as an easy target, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. James had dealt with far more dangerous people in his past, and he had always come out on top. He was no longer bound by the rules that governed the everyday world. This was different. This was personal. The quiet of the evening was broken only by the hum of his phone. James pulled it from his pocket and sent a message with a single sentence. "It's time." The response was immediate. Within minutes, his old comrades began to arrive, men he had fought alongside in distant lands, men who knew the price of disloyalty and betrayal. These were not just friends. These were brothers in arms, seasoned veterans who knew how to handle themselves in any situation. James didn't need to say much. They knew the task at hand, and they knew the stakes. The plan was simple, and it was already in motion. He didn't need to lay out a long strategy. This wasn't about stealth or subtlety. It was about making a statement. Those who had dared to destroy his home would face real consequences. They would come face to face with the kind of men they had never imagined, men who didn't ask for permission, men who acted with purpose and precision. As the team assembled, James took a deep breath, his anger simmering under the surface. This wasn't about blind revenge. It was about respect. They had chosen to push him into a corner and now they would feel the weight of their actions. It was a reminder, a lesson that some lines should never be crossed, especially when you didn't know the man you were dealing with. The soldiers moved quickly, silently, a well-oiled machine as they set up the operations. Their preparations were swift, their movements precise, no hesitation, no mistakes. They were ready. And now it was time to make sure these fake guards knew exactly what it meant to cross a man who had lived by a different code. A man who had once led the best of the best in operations that had no room for failure. They would learn that not all power was given by badges or titles. Some power came from the sheer will of a person who refused to be intimidated. James stood in the middle of the chaos, watching as the men took their positions, ready to carry out the plan. A cold determination settled over him as he thought about the destruction of his gates, about the disrespect these impostors had shown. His home was more than just bricks and iron. It was his life, his sanctuary, and there was no force on earth, not even the so-called HOA enforcers, that would take that from him. With his team in place and the plan set, James allowed himself a brief moment to savor the thought of what was coming. The fake guards might have thought they could break his spirit, but they were about to learn a lesson in power they would never forget. This was no longer just about gates. It was about honor, and it was about sending a message. The stage was set, and now James Harrison was ready to make them pay. The days felt longer, the nights colder. James could feel the weight of his frustration settling deeper into his chest with every passing hour. The sight of his ruined gates, once a symbol of safety, now twisted and broken, had become a constant reminder of the disrespect he'd suffered. It wasn't just metal and iron that had been destroyed. It was a part of his life, his pride. Years of hard work, years of sacrifice, all trampled underfoot by strangers who thought they could walk into his life and leave it in pieces. His hands clenched into fists as he stared at the damage. The gates weren't just an object. They were the threshold to everything he valued: his home, his peace, his security. And now those invaders had left their mark. The feeling of powerlessness that had washed over him when he first saw the destruction still lingered, burning like a raw wound. But as each day passed, that feeling shifted, slowly turning into something darker. Anger. A seething, relentless fury that twisted in his gut, demanding action. He had been patient, he had stayed calm, but no more. James was no longer the man who had quietly returned to his fortress each night. He had become something else. A man driven by a need to restore balance, to reclaim his sense of security, no matter the cost. The world outside his gates might have thought him docile, but those who had dared to destroy what he held dear were about to learn just how wrong they were. The evening was heavy with the promise of change. Dark clouds hung low in the sky, casting a shadow over his property, as if the very air knew what was about to unfold. A cool breeze whispered through the trees, carrying the distant hum of engines, and that sound was enough to stir something deep within James. It was time. His old comrades, the ones who had never forgotten their loyalty to him, were here. He could hear their vehicles drawing closer. Familiar sounds, the rumble of engines that had once echoed across battlefields and through silent nights in hostile lands. This time, the battlefield was different. His enemies were not soldiers or insurgents. They were impostors, men who thought they could tear down what James had spent a lifetime building. But those men didn't understand. They hadn't seen what he had seen, hadn't lived through the things he had. They didn't know the kind of man they had challenged. James stood in the window, watching the cars pull up to his property. The headlights cut through the darkening air, illuminating his team as they climbed out, ready for action. He didn't need to give orders. They knew exactly what was expected of them. They had been through hell together. Now they were here for one reason, to make sure these trespassers paid for what they had done. His enemies stood by the gates, unaware that they were no longer the ones in control. They thought they had broken him, that their act of destruction had gone unnoticed, that they had won. But they were wrong. They didn't realize that James Harrison wasn't a man who would ever yield. He wasn't a man who would let his home, his dignity, his entire way of life be trampled without consequence. The calmness of their presence by the gates was their greatest mistake. They had underestimated the fire inside James, the rage that had built within him, that had festered and burned, was now about to erupt. As his team took their positions, James felt that familiar rush, the feeling that came when you knew a confrontation was imminent, when every second felt like a moment of purpose. His heart beat with a steady, controlled intensity. His mind was clear, focused. There was no turning back now. James wasn't just defending his property. He was defending everything that had shaped him, everything he had fought for. He wasn't going to allow some fake guards to think they could walk away from this unscathed. He would make sure they understood the price of their actions. As the team prepared for what was to come, James allowed himself a moment of stillness, a quiet resolve. The storm that had been building inside him was about to break, and when it did, there would be no stopping it. The gates were gone, but what lay beyond them was something far more powerful. His enemies had woken something inside him, something they would soon regret. James Harrison was no longer just a homeowner. He was a man with a purpose. And tonight he would remind these invaders that crossing him had been their biggest mistake. The first light of dawn filtered through the trees, casting a soft glow over the broken gates. Now, a symbol of the chaos that had once reigned over James's peaceful life. But today was different. The quiet of the morning was not the silence of defeat, but of anticipation. James's enemies had no idea what awaited them. As the fake guards made their way toward the wreckage of the gates, their steps slow and casual, they resumed their routine. They believed they were in control as they had been the day before, thinking they could walk all over James without any consequences. But what they didn't notice, what they couldn't see, was the shadow of something much larger, closing in around them. The quiet stillness of the morning was broken by the sound of footsteps, dozens of them. And then, just as their backs were turned, the figures emerged. Dressed in camouflage, their faces hidden behind hoods, each one armed and prepared for whatever came next. These were no amateurs. They were trained, disciplined, and ready for action. James's old comrades had arrived, and they weren't here to negotiate. The fake guards froze as they realized they were surrounded. Panic began to stir in their eyes, but it was too late. James stepped forward, his presence unmistakable. He stood at the center, calm and collected, the leader once more. As he pulled back the hood of his jacket, his face became clear to everyone present. A moment of recognition passed through the ranks of the guards. They had seen him before, but they had never understood who they were dealing with. James's voice cut through the air, cool and controlled. "Did you really think I'd never come back?" he asked, a slight smile playing on his lips. His words weren't threatening. They didn't need to be. His confidence was enough. "Well, as you can see, I'm still in charge." The realization hit them all at once. This wasn't just a homeowner they had wronged. This was James Harrison, a man with far more authority than they had ever imagined. These weren't the kind of people who could be intimidated or silenced. They were about to learn the true meaning of consequences. Within moments, the situation had shifted entirely. The guards were no longer in control. The air, once thick with tension, was now heavy with the finality of what was unfolding. James didn't need to raise a hand. His presence was enough. The fake guards were quickly detained, their bravado evaporating as the reality of the situation set in. They had met their match. James turned to one of his men, a look of quiet satisfaction in his eyes. "Let them go," he ordered. "I want them to learn this lesson, but they'll never come back here." As the guards were escorted away, their faces filled with confusion and disbelief, James stood tall, watching them leave. There was no need for further action. The message had been delivered, and justice had been served. He had protected his home, his peace, and his dignity. And he had done it without lifting a finger in anger. With the sound of the vehicles fading into the distance, James allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. The storm had passed, and in its wake, a sense of calm had returned. The feeling of reclaiming control, of restoring balance to his life, washed over him. His home was safe again. The gates, though broken, were no longer the symbol of his defeat. They had become a reminder of the strength he had found within himself, a strength that had been tested and proven. And as the sun rose higher in the sky, James Harrison knew that he had won.